You've been living off our family's money for 15 years. It's time everyone knew the truth. The accusation echoed through the expensively decorated living room of the Harrington estate, where the entire family had gathered for my father-in-law's 75th birthday celebration. My sister-in-law, Victoria, stood triumphantly, champagne glass in hand, as 50 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me, the supposed gold digger who had married into their prestigious family. Little did she know that the trust fund manager sitting quietly in the corner was about to turn her world upside down with a single document that would reveal who had actually been funding the Harrington fortune all these years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the gathered Harrington clan as Richard, my father-in-law, prepared to blow out the candles on his elaborately decorated birthday cake. At 75, he still commanded the room with his imposing presence, silver hair perfectly coiffed, custom-tailored suit accentuating his still athletic frame, and that signature Harrington confidence that bordered on arrogance. The dynasty he'd built in Westbrook, Connecticut was legendary, as was the wealth that supposedly came with it. "Make a wish, Dad," called out my husband, James, his arm comfortably draped around my waist. I smiled and clapped along with everyone. Else, though, I could feel Victoria's icy stare from across the room. My sister-in-law had never approved of me, the middle-class girl from Ohio who had somehow managed to capture her brother's heart 15 years ago. According to Victoria's carefully curated family narrative, I was an opportunist who had seduced James for his money, despite the fact that I had my own successful career as an investment strategist when we'd met. Richard closed his eyes momentarily, then blew out all 75 candles in one impressive breath. The room erupted in applause. "Speech!" someone called out, and Richard nodded, accepting the spotlight with practiced ease. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the living room. 75 years. Quite a milestone. They say a man's legacy is measured by two things, his accomplishments and his family. Tonight, I'm proud of both. His gaze swept across the room, acknowledging each family member in turn. When his eyes met mine, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite identify. Pride? Gratitude? Before I could analyze it further, Victoria stepped forward, her champagne glass raised high. "To Dad," she said, her voice carrying that distinctive Harrington authority. "And to the Harrington legacy that he's built. A legacy that some of us have sacrificed to maintain, while others have simply reaped its benefits." The subtle emphasis on others wasn't lost on anyone. A few uncomfortable glances darted my way as Victoria continued. "I think it's time we all acknowledged who truly belongs in this family and who has been taking advantage of the Harrington name and fortune." James stiffened beside me. "Victoria, this isn't the time or place," he warned, his voice low. But Victoria had been waiting for this moment. 15 years of thinly veiled hostility was about to come flooding out, and nothing would stop her, now. "You've been living off our family's money for 15 years, she said, pointing her champagne glass directly at me. "It's time everyone knew the truth." The room fell silent. 50 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me, cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends, all waiting for my response to this public accusation. "My name is Olivia Harrington, formerly Olivia Mitchell. I'm 43 years old, and until this moment, I had maintained my dignity in the face of Victoria's constant insinuations that I was nothing more than a gold digger who had married into the prestigious Harrington family for their supposed fortune. I took a deep breath, preparing to defend myself yet again, when an unexpected voice broke the silence. "Actually, Ms. Harrington, I believe there's something you should know." All heads turned toward the source of the voice, a slender man, in his 60s wearing an understated but clearly expensive suit. Martin Caldwell, the Harrington family's trust fund manager, had been sitting quietly in the corner for most of the evening, observing the family dynamics with professional detachment. Now he stood, a leather portfolio in his hands. "Mr. Harrington," he said, addressing Richard, "I wasn't planning to do this tonight, but given the circumstances, perhaps it's time we reviewed the terms of the trust." Richard looked momentarily alarmed but quickly regained his composure. "Martin, surely this can wait for a more appropriate time." "I'm afraid not," Martin replied firmly. "Not if we're discussing who has contributed to the Harrington legacy and who has merely benefited from it." Victoria smiled triumphantly, clearly believing that Martin was about to provide evidence supporting her accusations. The smug satisfaction on her face made my stomach clench. For 15 years, I had endured her snide comments, her dismissive attitudes, her constant implications that I had married James for his money rather than love. James squeezed my hand reassuringly. "Whatever. We'll face it together," he whispered. That was James. Always by my side, always my partner. That was why I had fallen in love with him at that finance conference in Chicago 15 years ago, long before I knew about his family name or supposed wealth. Martin opened his portfolio and extracted a document. "With your permission, Mr. Harrington?" he asked, but it wasn't really a question. Richard nodded reluctantly, lowering himself slowly into his armchair as if suddenly feeling every one of his 75 years. 15 years ago, Martin began, addressing the room at large, the Harrington family trust was on the verge of collapse. The financial crisis had hit the family's investments particularly hard, and some questionable decisions had left the estate in significant debt. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the room. This was not common knowledge among the extended family. Victoria's triumphant expression faltered slightly. "At that critical moment," Martin continued, "a substantial investment was made into the trust, an investment that not only saved the Harrington estate, but has been the primary source of the family's continued prosperity over the past 15 years. He paused, looking directly at Victoria. That investment came from Olivia Mitchell, now Olivia Harrington, from the proceeds of her own family's business, which she had recently sold. The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips, her expression one of shocked disbelief. My mind flashed back to that moment, 15 years ago, when James had finally confessed the truth about his family's financial situation. We had been engaged for 6 months, and I had just sold my family's small but successful investment firm after my parents' passing. The sale had left me with substantial capital, and James had been honest about his family's struggles, despite his father's insistence on maintaining the illusion of wealth. The initial investment of $12 million, Martin continued, has, under Olivia's guidance, grown to support not only the main Harrington estate, but also the individual trust funds that many of you benefit from today. I felt James's hand tighten around mine. We had agreed never to disclose this arrangement to the extended family. Richard had been too proud to admit his financial failures, and I had never wanted my contribution to be known, fearing exactly this type of situation where it would appear I was seeking credit or gratitude. Victoria's face had turned ashen. "That's impossible," she stammered. "Dad would never. We would never need." "The documentation is quite clear," Martin said, holding up the papers. "Olivia's contribution saved this family from financial ruin, and her investment strategies have been the foundation of its recovery and growth." Richard stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "I think," he said carefully, "that it's time for some truth." He walked across the room until he stood directly in front of me. The patriarch of the Harrington family, a man known for his pride and stubborn refusal to show vulnerability, looked me in the eyes. "I've never properly thanked you," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "My pride wouldn't allow it. But you didn't just save our family's finances, Olivia. You saved my legacy, and you never asked for recognition." The room remained silent, everyone processing this revelation that completely inverted the narrative. Victoria had been pushing for years. I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that the truth was finally out, embarrassment at being the center of attention, and a strange sense of liberation from the burden of this secret. Victoria set down her champagne glass with a sharp clink and strode toward the door, her husband trailing awkwardly behind her. Before exiting, she turned. "Why?" she demanded, looking directly at me. "If this is true, why would you do that? And say nothing for 15 years? It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. "Because I love James," I said simply. "And he loves his family. That includes you, Victoria." Victoria's expression flickered between anger, confusion, and something that might have been the first glimmer of respect. Without another word, she left, the heavy door closing behind her with a definitive thud. The atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Family members who had previously treated me with polite distance were now looking at me with new eyes. Some seemed embarrassed by their past behavior, others simply shocked. James turned to face me, taking both my hands in his. "I think it's time we told them the whole story," he said quietly. I nodded. Perhaps it was finally time to share how our journey had really begun, how a chance meeting at a finance conference had led not only to love, but to a partnership that had quietly saved the Harrington legacy. Richard cleared his throat. "I believe we all owe Olivia our attention," he announced to the room, "and I, for one, owe her much more than that." As the family gathered closer to hear our story, I thought about the path that had led me here. 15 years of navigating the complex dynamics of the Harrington family, of quietly contributing while being viewed as an outsider by some. 15 years of knowing the truth while allowing others to believe whatever narrative made them comfortable. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria had spent a decade and a half painting me as a gold digger, someone who had married into the Harrington family for financial gain. The reality was precisely the opposite. My thoughts drifted back to that pivotal moment when James had finally revealed his family's financial troubles. We had been sitting in my small apartment in Chicago, planning our wedding. He had been uncharacteristically quiet all evening, and when he finally spoke, his voice had been heavy with shame. "There's something I need to tell you," he had said, unable to meet my eyes. "Something about my family." The prestigious Harrington name, the estate in Connecticut, the generations of wealth, it had all been a carefully maintained illusion. The financial crisis had devastated their investments, and Richard's risky attempts to recover their losses had only deepened their troubles. They were months away from losing everything, including the family home that had been in their possession for 4 generations. I remember James's surprise when I didn't react with shock or disappointment. The truth was, I had fallen in love with him, not his family name or perceived wealth. I had fallen for his kindness, his integrity, his brilliant mind, and his gentle heart. The revelation that he wasn't as wealthy as everyone believed didn't change any of that. What had changed was my perspective on what I could do with the proceeds from my family's business. My parents had built their investment firm from nothing, working tirelessly to create something meaningful. When they passed away within months of each other, leaving me as their only heir, I had sold the firm, uncertain of what to do with the unexpected wealth. James had never asked for my help. In fact, he had been adamant that our marriage should be postponed until he could resolve his family's financial troubles. It was my suggestion that we find a solution together, as partners. The investment into the Harrington Trust had been structured meticulously by Martin Caldwell, who had been the only person outside of James, Richard, and myself to know the full truth. Richard had initially refused, his pride standing in the way of acceptance. It had taken James weeks to convince his father that this wasn't charity, but a sound business decision, an investment in our shared future. As I looked around the room at the faces of the Harrington family, many now seeing me truly for the first time, I realized that perhaps this revelation had been necessary. 15 years of quiet contribution had preserved Richard's pride, but had also allowed misconceptions to fester. Sometimes the truth, however uncomfortable, is the only path to genuine understanding. James began to tell our story to the gathered family, his voice filled with a pride I had rarely heard when he spoke about me. Not pride in my financial contribution, but pride in the partnership we had built, in the way we had faced challenges, together from the very beginning. I watched Richard's face as he listened to his son. The patriarch's expression had softened, the weight of a 15-year secret finally lifting from his shoulders. He caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod, an acknowledgement that contained both gratitude and apology. As for Victoria, her abrupt departure left an open question. Would this revelation change her perception of me, or would it simply give her new ammunition in her ongoing resentment? Only time would tell. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt completely free within the Harrington family circle. Free of secrets, free of unspoken judgments, free to be fully myself. The revelation at Richard's birthday celebration marked the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. A chapter where the truth about who had really been supporting whom was finally acknowledged, where the narrative Victoria had constructed about me crumbled in the face of reality. But more than that, it marked the beginning of a more authentic relationship with the family I had married into. Not as the outsider who had supposedly married for money, but as the partner who had quietly helped preserve a legacy while asking for nothing in return. As James finished telling our story, Richard walked slowly toward me, the eyes of the entire family following his movement. The patriarch of the Harrington family, a man known for his stoic demeanor and reluctance to display emotion, stood before me with tears in his eyes. "Olivia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have failed to acknowledge your contribution to this family for far too long. Pride is a dangerous thing. It kept me from admitting my failures, and it kept me from properly welcoming you as a daughter." He turned to address the entire family. "The Harrington legacy stands today because of Olivia's generosity and financial acumen. For 15 years, I've allowed some of you to believe otherwise, to treat her as an outsider, when in truth, she has been the foundation of our continued prosperity." The impact of his words was visible on every face in the room. Some family members looked embarrassed, others shocked, but all were reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the family dynamics. As the evening continued, I found myself surrounded by family members who suddenly wanted to get to know me better, to understand the woman behind the quiet contribution that had saved their inheritance. It was overwhelming, yet strangely liberating. Through it all, James remained by my side, his pride in me evident in every introduction, every retelling of how we had weathered that financial storm together at the beginning of our marriage. This was the partnership I had signed up for 15 years ago, facing challenges together, supporting each other without keeping score. The revelation had been unexpected, but perhaps it was time. Time for the truth to reshape the narrative that Victoria had been spreading. Time for authentic relationships to form within the family. Time for me to step fully into my role not as an outsider who had married into wealth, but as a central architect of the family's continued prosperity. As James and I drove home that night, the weight of a 15-year secret finally lifted. I couldn't help but wonder what this new chapter would bring. Victoria's accusation had backfired spectacularly, but the ripple effects would continue to shape our family dynamics for years to come. Sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it completely transforms the story everyone thought they knew. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after Richard's birthday revelation, I woke before James, the early spring sunlight filtering through our bedroom windows. Our home, a renovated colonial in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from the main Harrington estate, had always been our sanctuary. Unlike the sprawling family mansion with its marble floors and antique furniture, our home was warm, lived in, designed for comfort rather than impression. I slipped out of bed, wrapped a robe around myself, and padded downstairs to make coffee. As the machine hummed to life, I checked my phone and wasn't surprised to find it flooded with messages from various Harrington family members. Some were apologetic, others curious, all of them reacting to the bombshell that had dropped last night. I set the phone aside, choosing to savor the quiet morning before diving into the family drama. 15 years of silence had ended in a single evening. 15 years of allowing Victoria's narrative about me to flourish unchallenged. I didn't regret my decision to keep quiet about my financial contribution to the family. It had been made out of love for James and respect for Richard's pride. But I couldn't deny the relief I felt now that the truth was out. It was like setting down a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten how it felt to stand straight. James appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep. "Hey," he said softly, coming to wrap his arms around me from behind. "You okay?" I leaned back into his embrace. "I'm fine, just processing." "Any regrets?" he asked, reaching around me for a coffee mug. I considered the question carefully. No, not about the investment, not about keeping it quiet, and not about it coming out now. It was all as it should be. James turned me to face him, his expression serious. "You've always been the strongest person I know, Olivia. Most people in your position would have thrown that investment in Victoria's face years ago." "And what would that have accomplished?" I asked. "More resentment? More division? Besides, it was never about getting credit." "I know," he said. "That's what makes you extraordinary." The doorbell rang, interrupting our moment. James raised an eyebrow. "Bit early for visitors." I checked the security camera on my phone and was surprised to see Richard standing on our porch, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. He was alone, without his usual driver, dressed more casually than I'd ever seen him in public. "It's your father," I told James, setting down my coffee. We opened the door together. Richard Harrington stood before us, the morning light accentuating the lines on his face that had deepened overnight. For perhaps the first time since I'd known him, he looked his age. "May I come in?" he asked, the usual command absent from his voice. "Of course." James stepped aside, exchanging a quick glance with me. His father rarely visited our home, preferring to summon us to the estate for family matters. Richard followed us into the kitchen, but declined the offer of coffee. He remained standing, as if sitting might somehow diminish the importance of what he had come to say. "Olivia," he began, then paused, uncharacteristically struggling for words. "I spent the night thinking about how to adequately express what needs to be said, and I realized there's no eloquent way to address 15 years of oversight." "Dad, you don't need to," James started, but Richard held up a hand. "I do, son. I very much do." He turned back to me. "Pride is a Harrington family trait, as you well know. It served us well in building our reputation, in maintaining our position in society even when the financial reality didn't match the perception. But pride becomes destructive when it prevents acknowledgement of truth." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This morning, I had Martin draw up new documentation for the family trust. It formally acknowledges your contribution and places you as co-trustee alongside myself." I stared at the envelope but didn't take it. "Richard, that's not necessary. I never wanted—" "I know what you wanted," he interrupted gently. "You wanted to help the man you loved and his family. You wanted no recognition, no power, no control in return. That selflessness is precisely why you deserve this position. He set the envelope on the counter between us. The Harrington legacy continues because of you, Olivia. It's time you had a formal role in shaping its future. The gesture was significant, not just legally, but symbolically. In the hierarchical structure of the Harrington family, the trustee position was one of ultimate authority, traditionally held only by the patriarch. What about Victoria? I asked, knowing that this decision would only fuel her resentment. Richard's expression hardened slightly. Victoria will need to come to terms with reality. Her behavior last night was unacceptable, regardless of what she believed to be true. Have you spoken with her? James asked. Richard sighed. I tried this morning. She refused to take my call. Bradford said she's processing and will speak to me when she's ready. Bradford, Victoria's husband of 20 years, had always been caught in the complicated web of Harrington family dynamics, acting as messenger and peacemaker during Victoria's periodic conflicts with her father. Give her time, I suggested. This revelation has upended her understanding of the family structure. That's not easy to accept, especially for someone who values her position in the hierarchy as much as Victoria does. Richard studied me with newfound respect. You're more generous toward her than most would be in your position. I shrugged. Holding on to resentment only hurts the person carrying it. A wisdom the Harringtons could benefit from adopting, Richard acknowledged with a small smile. Now, there's one more matter I need to discuss with you both. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. For the past 5 years, I've been documenting the true history of the Harrington family, not the polished version we present to society, but the real story, with all its flaws and triumphs. He set the notebook beside the envelope. I'd like you both to read it, especially you, Olivia, to understand the context of the family you married into, and perhaps to add your chapter to it. The gesture was unprecedented. Richard had always been the guardian of the Harrington narrative, carefully controlling which aspects of family history were discussed and which remained private. This invitation to view the unvarnished truth represented a remarkable shift. Thank you, I said simply, recognizing the gift for what it was. Trust, finally extended without reservation. Richard nodded, seemingly satisfied with what he had accomplished. I should go. Victoria may not be ready to talk, but there are others in the family I need to speak with today. As James walked his father to the door, I remained in the kitchen, looking at the 2 items Richard had left, the legal document acknowledging my role in saving the family fortune, and the personal history revealing the truths behind the Harrington facade. Together they represented a new beginning, a shift from outsider to insider that had been 15 years in the making. James returned, studying my expression carefully. You okay? Yes, I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. I think I am. My phone chimed with an incoming text. I glanced at it, expecting another message from a family member, but instead saw a name that made my heart skip. Victoria. The message was brief. We need to talk. Alone. The Westbrook Bistro, 1 p.m. I showed the text to James, who frowned. You don't have to meet with her, you know. After last night, no one would blame you for keeping your distance. I know, I replied, but this might be the only chance to reset our relationship. 15 years is a long time to carry resentment. James kissed my forehead. And that right there is why I fell in love with you in Chicago. Your capacity for compassion has always been extraordinary. 4 hours later, I sat at a corner table in the Westbrook Bistro, a quiet restaurant known for its discretion, where local professionals and wealthy families could have conversations without worry of being overheard. I had arrived early, choosing a seat with a view of the entrance. Victoria arrived precisely at 1, punctuality being another Harrington trait. She spotted me immediately, her posture stiffening slightly before she made her way to the table. Unlike last night, when she had been dressed to impress in designer evening wear, today she wore a simple blouse and trousers, her usual perfect makeup noticeably subdued. "Thank you for coming," she said as she sat down, skipping any pleasantries. That was Victoria, direct to the point of abruptness. "Of course," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. A server approached, but Victoria waved him away with a practiced gesture. "I won't be staying long." Once we were alone again, she fixed me with a penetrating gaze. "I need to understand why. Why invest millions in a family that didn't accept you? Why keep it secret for 15 years? And most importantly, why allow me to treat you the way I did when you could have shut me down with a single word?" The questions were asked rapidly, with the intensity of someone who had been turning them over in her mind all night. They deserved a thoughtful response. "The investment was simple," I began. "I loved James. He loved his family. The money from my parents' business was never as important to me as building a life with the man I loved." Victoria's expression remained skeptical. "And the secrecy? Was that James's idea? Or my father's?" "It was mutual," I explained. "Richard wasn't ready to admit the family's financial situation to everyone. James wanted to protect his father's pride, and I never wanted the dynamic between us to be about money." "But it was about money," Victoria argued. "The difference is that it was your money, not ours." I shook my head. "It was never about the money for me, Victoria. Not when I married James, and not in how I've approached my relationship with the Harrington family." Victoria fell silent, her fingers tapping restlessly on the table as she processed my response. "I've spent 15 years believing you married my brother for his supposed wealth, for the Harrington name. I've treated you accordingly." "Yes, you have," I acknowledged. "Aren't you angry?" she demanded. "Don't you hate me for it?" I considered the question carefully. There were times I was hurt, times I was frustrated. But hate? No. You were protecting your family as you understood it. I can respect the motivation, if not the methods. Victoria looked genuinely confused by my response. "So what happens now? My father has apparently made you a co-trustee. You hold power over the family finances, power over me, essentially. What do you intend to do with it?" The question revealed so much about how Victoria viewed the world, as a constant power struggle, a zero-sum game where someone's gain was necessarily another's loss. It explained much about her behavior over the years. "I don't see it as power over you or anyone else," I replied. "The trustee position is a responsibility, not a weapon." Victoria's laugh was sharp, disbelieving. "That's not how the Harrington family works, Olivia. Everything is about power and position, always has been." "Maybe that's part of the problem," I suggested quietly. For the first time in our conversation, Victoria appeared taken aback. She studied me with new intensity, as if truly seeing me for the first time. "You really are different, aren't you? All these years I thought your down-to-earth persona was an act to curry favor with my brother." "No act," I assured her. "Just me." Victoria sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Bradford said I owe you an apology. He's probably right, but apologies don't come easily to Harringtons," I finished for her with a small smile. "It's okay. I'm not looking for one." "What are you looking for then?" she asked, genuinely curious. "A fresh start, maybe. A chance to get to know each other without the assumptions that have colored our relationship from the beginning." Victoria considered this, her innate skepticism warring with something new, perhaps respect, or at least curiosity. "I'm not sure I know how to do that. 15 years is a long time to think of someone a certain way." "We can figure it out as we go," I suggested. "No pressure, no timeline." She nodded slowly, then reached for her purse, a signal that our conversation was coming to an end. Before standing, she paused, seeming to debate whether to say something more. "My father gave you his journal," she said finally, a statement rather than a question. "Yes," I confirmed, surprised she knew about it. "There are things in there. Things about our family that aren't flattering. About me as well." A vulnerability I had never seen before flickered across her face. "Just remember that people can change. That we're more than our worst moments." It was the closest thing to a plea I had ever heard from Victoria Harrington. It revealed something important. She cared what I thought of her, now that she knew the truth. "I'll remember," I promised. Victoria stood, gathering her composure like a cloak around her. "I've reserved a private room at the Grill next Thursday evening, a small family dinner. Just James, you, Bradford, and me. If you're available." The invitation was significant. Victoria's restaurants of choice were always strategic, and the Grill was where she took people she wanted to impress. More importantly, this would be the first time she had ever initiated a social engagement that included me without the presence of the entire extended family. "We'll be there," I said. With a nod, Victoria turned and walked out of the restaurant, her posture impeccable as always, but somehow less rigid than when she had arrived. As I watched her go, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. The revelation at Richard's birthday celebration had been shocking, dramatic even, but perhaps necessary, to break through 15 years of established patterns. Victoria and I would never be best friends. Our personalities and values were too different for that. But maybe we could build something new, something authentic, based on truth rather than misconception. I paid the bill and stepped outside, into the spring sunshine. My phone showed 3 missed calls from James, no doubt anxious about how the meeting had gone. Before calling him back, I took a moment to appreciate how much had changed in just 24 hours. The truth had finally come to light, not by my design, but perhaps at exactly the right moment. Victoria's public accusation had led to a revelation that might ultimately heal rather than divide the family I had married into. Sometimes, the most painful moments become catalysts for necessary change. I thought about Richard's journal waiting for me at home, containing the real history of the Harrington family. I thought about Victoria's unexpected vulnerability and the dinner invitation that represented a first tentative step toward reconciliation. I thought about James, who had stood by me through 15 years of complex family dynamics, never wavering in his support. The Harrington family saga was far from over, but perhaps now it could evolve into something healthier, something built on truth rather than appearances. And in that evolution, I would no longer be the outsider looking in, but an acknowledged architect of the family's future. With that thought warming me more than the spring sunshine, I called James to share the news of this unexpected beginning. That evening, after recounting my lunch with Victoria to James, we settled in our home library to examine Richard's journal. The room was my favorite in our house, walls lined with bookshelves, comfortable leather chairs positioned near the fireplace, and large windows overlooking our garden. Unlike the formal, rarely used library at the Harrington estate, ours was lived in, with books actually read rather than collected for appearance. "Are you sure you want to do this tonight?" James asked, eyeing the worn leather notebook on the coffee table between us. "It's been an intense couple of days," I nodded, curling up in my chair with a glass of wine. "I'm curious. Your father doesn't share personal thoughts easily. For him to entrust us with this." I let the sentence trail off, the significance clear to both of us. James picked up the journal, running his fingers over its weathered cover. He's kept journals my whole life. I remember seeing him writing in them when I was a child, but he never shared their contents. Not with me, not with Victoria, not even with my mother when she was alive. He handed the notebook to me. "You should be the one to read it first. After everything that's happened, You deserve to understand the full context of the family you married into." I accepted the journal, feeling its weight, both physical and metaphorical. "Let's read it together," I suggested, moving to sit beside James on the small sofa. Opening to the first page, I was struck by Richard's elegant, precise handwriting. The journal didn't begin with his birth or childhood as I might have expected, but rather with a simple date, April 17th, 1972, and the words, "Today I married Catherine Blackwell, and so continued the careful merger of fortunes that my father arranged." We exchanged glances. James's mother had passed away when he was 16 and Victoria 18. She had always been described in reverent terms, the perfect Harrington wife, the cornerstone of the family's social standing. This opening line painted a different picture entirely. As we read on, a very different Harrington family history emerged than the one that had been carefully curated for public consumption. Richard's marriage to Catherine had indeed been arranged by their parents, a union of two struggling aristocratic families trying to maintain the appearance of wealth and status while their actual fortunes dwindled. "The Blackwell name still carries weight, though their accounts are nearly empty," Richard had written. "Father assures me this is how the great families have always operated. Appearance first, with financial reality a distant second. I'm not convinced this approach is sustainable, but I see no alternative at present." James looked stunned. "He never. I always thought they married for love." "Perhaps they found love later," I suggested gently. We continued reading. Richard documented the early years of his marriage with surprising candor. The pressure to maintain appearances, the birth of Victoria and later James, and Catherine's increasing discomfort with the gap between their public facade and private reality. "Catherine wants to scale back, to live within our actual means rather than the means we pretend to have," one entry from 1979 read. "Her pragmatism makes sense, but she doesn't understand that for families like ours, perception is the only currency we truly possess. If we were to publicly acknowledge our financial limitations, generations of careful positioning would collapse overnight." The journal detailed Richard's various business ventures through the 1980s and 90s, some successful, others disastrous, but all carefully masked behind the Harrington name's continuing prestige. Catherine's voice appeared less and less in the narrative as the years progressed, her objections apparently silenced or ignored. Then came the entry from February 1998 that made James physically flinch. "Catherine is gone. Cancer took her quickly, mercifully. She never revealed our financial struggles to the children, honoring my wishes to the end, though I know she disagreed. Victoria has absorbed the Harrington philosophy completely, appearance above all else. James, however, shows troubling signs of Catherine's pragmatism. He questions too much, sees through the facade in ways that concern me." James closed his eyes briefly. "I always thought I disappointed him because I wasn't ruthless enough in business. I never realized it was because I reminded him of Mom." I squeezed his hand, and we continued reading. The next decade chronicled Victoria's growing role as the family's standard-bearer, while James pursued his own career path in finance, distancing himself from daily involvement in family affairs. Richard's pride in Victoria's dedication to the Harrington image was evident, as was his complicated relationship with James's independence. Then came 2008, the financial crisis that devastated the already precarious Harrington finances. Richard's writing became more frantic, documenting increasingly desperate attempts to shore up their crumbling financial foundation while maintaining the appearance of unaffected wealth. "The Harrington legacy rests on quicksand," he wrote in late 2008. "4 generations of maintaining appearances while quietly selling off assets has left us with little more than a name and a facade. I've mortgaged everything that remains to make one final attempt at recovery through Madison Partners' new venture. If this fails, there will be nothing left to hide behind." James looked up. Madison Partners, that was Harrison Wells's investment firm. They collapsed completely in 2009. I nodded, remembering the notorious financial scandal. Taking their investors down with them. We turned the page to find the entry that changed everything, dated just weeks before James and I had met at the Chicago Finance Conference. Richard's usually immaculate handwriting was uncharacteristically erratic, betraying his emotional state. It's over. Madison Partners has failed completely, taking the last of our capital with it. The banks are calling in the estate's mortgages. Victoria doesn't yet know the severity of our situation. She continues to plan elaborate events and speak of the Harrington legacy as if it were as secure as ever. James suspects something is wrong but hasn't asked directly. I have perhaps 3 months before everything collapses publicly. The thought of being the Harrington who finally failed to maintain the illusion is unbearable. The next entry, dated 2 months later, mentioned James bringing me to meet his father for the first time. Richard's initial assessment was coolly analytical. James's new fiancée, Olivia Mitchell, comes from new money. Her family's business successful but without pedigree. She seems intelligent, observant. I wonder if she sees through our facade. James appears genuinely infatuated, though I question his timing. He's never shown interest in advantageous matches before. James winced. I'm sorry. He clearly thought, I might be marrying you for your money. I smiled slightly. Ironic, considering what Victoria has been suggesting for 15 years. The entry that followed documented James finally confronting his father about the family's financial situation, insisting on transparency with me before our marriage. Richard's response was a mixture of shame, anger, and reluctant respect for his son's integrity. Then came the entry that brought tears to my eyes. James's fiancée has proposed a solution I would never have anticipated. After learning of our imminent financial collapse, rather than breaking the engagement as I expected, she has offered to invest her family's business proceeds into the Harrington estate through a carefully structured trust. Her condition is not control or recognition, but merely discretion. She wishes the arrangement to remain private, known only to James, myself, and the trust manager. I was prepared to refuse this charity outright, but something in the way she presented it gave me pause. This isn't about saving the Harrington name, she told me. It's about giving James the freedom to choose his relationship with his family without financial collapse forcing his hand. For the first time in my life, I encountered generosity without agenda, investment without demand for control. I remain suspicious. No one gives millions without expecting return. But I find myself with no alternative but to accept, at least temporarily. James looked at me, his eyes shining. You never told me exactly what you said to him. I shrugged slightly. It was between your father and me. I knew you were torn between your love for me and your loyalty to your family. I wanted to remove that impossible choice. We continued reading as Richard documented the legal structure Martin Caldwell had created to save the Harrington estate while preserving Richard's public role as family patriarch. His initial skepticism about my motives gradually transformed over the entries that followed. 1 year since the Mitchell investment saved us from collapse, he wrote in 2010. I continue to watch for signs of Olivia leveraging her position, but they never materialize. She operates her own investment consulting business successfully, contributes financially sound advice when asked, but never intrudes, and most remarkably tolerates Victoria's thinly veiled hostility without complaint or retaliation. I find myself increasingly uncomfortable with the disparity between her contribution and her recognition within the family structure. Entries over the next several years documented Richard's gradual reassessment of the values he had championed throughout his life. He observed how Victoria continued to prioritize appearances above authenticity, while James and I built a life based on partnership and mutual respect. He noted with particular interest how my investment strategies quietly strengthened the family's actual wealth rather than merely its appearance of prosperity. The Mitchell investment approach, substance over appearance, long-term stability over short-term impression, has proven more successful than generations of Harrington posturing, he wrote in 2015. I find myself questioning the philosophy that has guided my entire life. What might have been possible if the Harringtons had built actual value rather than merely its appearance? The most recent entries revealed Richard's growing unease with Victoria's treatment of me and his own complicity in allowing it to continue. He documented private conversations with his daughter, attempting to moderate her hostility without revealing the truth about family finances. Victoria remains convinced that Olivia married James for the Harrington fortune and position, he wrote after one such conversation in 2022. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so unjust. My attempts to suggest a more respectful approach are interpreted as weakness or sentimentality. Victoria has become the perfect Harrington by the standards I once valued: appearance-focused, position-conscious, legacy-driven. And yet, I increasingly find those standards hollow. The final entry, dated just 1 week before Richard's birthday celebration, contained the words that explained his decision to allow Martin Caldwell to reveal the truth. I am 75 years old. For most of those years, I have perpetuated the Harrington illusion, maintaining the appearance of aristocratic wealth while hiding the reality of our limitations. I justified this deception as protecting our legacy, but in truth, it was pride. The same pride that has prevented me from acknowledging Olivia's role in saving that legacy for the past 15 years. Victoria's hostility toward her sister-in-law has reached a point I can no longer ignore. I overheard her planning some form of public confrontation at my birthday celebration, believing it an appropriate moment to expose Olivia's supposed opportunism. The time for illusions and appearances has passed. I have instructed Martin to prepare documentation acknowledging Olivia's contribution, to be revealed should Victoria proceed with her plans. The truth may damage the carefully constructed Harrington image, but perhaps that image has done more harm than good. A legacy built on deception is no legacy at all. James closed the journal slowly after we finished the final entry. For several minutes we sat in silence, processing the remarkable window into Richard's evolution and the context it provided for everything that had transpired at his birthday celebration. He knew, James said finally. He knew Victoria was planning something and deliberately prepared for it. I nodded. He chose truth over appearance, finally. After a lifetime of the opposite, James added, a complex mixture of emotions in his voice. I never really knew him, did I? All these years, I thought I understood his motivations, his values. But this... He gestured to the journal. This shows a complexity I never imagined. People can surprise us, I said softly. Even after decades, they can choose to change, to grow. James looked at me with a deepening appreciation. You've known about his struggles all these years, witnessed his internal conflict between pride and gratitude, and never once used it against him or Victoria. That would have defeated the entire purpose, I pointed out. I invested in your family because I wanted you to have the freedom to navigate your relationship with them without financial crisis forcing your hand. Using the truth as a weapon would have created exactly the kind of impossible choice I was trying to help you avoid. James pulled me close. How did you develop this perspective? This ability to play the long game with such patience and compassion? I thought about my parents, practical, hard-working people who had built their investment firm from nothing, valuing substance over appearance, integrity over impression. I learned from my parents that real value isn't in perception, but in creation. And from my grandmother, that resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. We sat together in comfortable silence, the journal between us serving as a physical reminder of how narratives can shift, how truth can emerge even after decades of careful concealment. The Harrington family history had been rewritten in a single evening, not by design but by the inevitable collision of long-maintained fiction with undeniable reality. "What happens now?" James asked finally. "We go to dinner with Victoria and Bradford on Thursday," I said. "We take that small opening and see if it can grow into something authentic. We acknowledge the past without being imprisoned by it." James nodded slowly. "And with my father?" "We honor his courage in finally choosing truth over appearance. It couldn't have been easy after a lifetime of the opposite." The journal had revealed a man far more complex than the patriarchal figure he presented to the world. A man struggling with the values he'd inherited, gradually recognizing their limitations, and finally finding the courage to chart a different course. It wasn't a perfect redemption story, but it was a human one. As I placed the journal back on the coffee table, I felt a deepened understanding of the family I had married into. The Harringtons were not simply the status-obsessed, appearance-focused aristocrats I had observed for 15 years. They were people caught in patterns established generations before, struggling in their own ways to reconcile inherited values with lived experience. Victoria's hostility toward me made more sense in this context. She had been raised to believe that appearance and position were everything, that the Harrington legacy was built on aristocratic superiority rather than careful illusion. My marriage to James had threatened that narrative even before the financial truth was revealed. With this new understanding came not just compassion, but hope. If Richard could evolve after 75 years of entrenched thinking, perhaps Victoria, too, could find her way to a more authentic perspective. The dinner invitation was a first small step, but a significant one. That night, as James and I prepared for bed, he asked the question that had clearly been on his mind throughout our reading of the journal. "Do you ever regret it? The investment, the years of silence, the treatment you endured from Victoria?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to give him complete honesty. "No," I said finally. "I've never regretted the investment itself. It allowed you to maintain your relationship with your family without crisis forcing artificial choices. I've occasionally regretted the silence when Victoria was particularly hostile, but telling the truth then would have created more problems than it solved." I touched his face gently. "The most valuable investments aren't measured in quarterly returns, James. They're measured in years, in relationships preserved, in authentic connections fostered. By that measure, these 15 years have been the best investment I've ever made." James's expression softened. "You've shown me what true strength looks like. Not dominance or control, but patience and principled compassion. I'm not sure I could have endured what you have." "We all have different strengths," I reminded him. "You've stood by me, supported me, never once pressured me to leverage my financial position within your family. That took its own kind of strength." As we drifted toward sleep, I thought about the dinner with Victoria and Bradford approaching on Thursday. I had no illusions that 15 years of established patterns would dissolve overnight. But Richard's journal had given me valuable insight into the family dynamics at play, and Victoria's invitation suggested an openness to change that hadn't existed before. The truth about the Harrington family finances had finally emerged, but the more important truth was about values, what truly constitutes wealth, legacy, and family. That was the revelation that held the potential for real transformation. Thursday arrived with a sense of anticipation that surprised me. In 15 years of marriage to James, I had never looked forward to a social engagement with Victoria. Our interactions had always been carefully choreographed affairs, where surface pleasantries masked underlying tension. This dinner represented something new, a deliberate step toward authenticity, however tentative. I chose my outfit with care, a midnight blue dress that was elegant without being showy, paired with a simple silver necklace that had belonged to my mother. James wore a charcoal suit, no tie, walking the line between formal and relaxed that seemed appropriate for this uncertain occasion. Nervous? He asked as we drove toward the Grill, one of Westbrook's most exclusive restaurants. Curious, I corrected. Victoria's never voluntarily sought my company before. I'm interested to see what version of her appears tonight. James smiled slightly. You've always had this remarkable ability to approach difficult situations with curiosity rather than anxiety. I'm still learning that skill. It's self-preservation as much as philosophy, I admitted. 15 years of navigating Harrington family dynamics either teaches you emotional detachment or drives you to madness. The Grill occupied the top floor of Westbrook's tallest building, offering panoramic views of the surrounding countryside. The maitre d' recognized us immediately. The Harrington name still opened doors, regardless of the recently revealed financial history behind it. Mrs. Harrington is already seated in the private dining room, he informed us, leading us through the main restaurant area where Westbrook's elite gathered for business dinners and social posturing. Victoria and Bradford were indeed waiting, both standing as we entered the intimate space with its floor-to-ceiling windows and single elegantly set table. Victoria wore a tailored black dress that emphasized her slim figure, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. Bradford, tall and distinguished with salt and pepper hair, stood slightly behind his wife, his expression warm but cautious. James, Olivia, Victoria nodded, gesturing to the table. Thank you for coming. The formality in her tone suggested this wasn't going to be an evening of sudden emotional breakthroughs, but I hadn't expected that. Victoria was a Harrington to her core. Change would come incrementally, if at all. After we were seated and wine was poured, an uncomfortable silence fell. Bradford, ever the diplomat, broke it first. Olivia, he said, his gentle British accent softening his words. I want to apologize for never stepping in during these past years. I knew how Victoria felt, and while I didn't share her perspective, I remained silent. That was cowardice on my part. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't contradict her husband. You were in a difficult position, I acknowledged, caught between loyalty to your wife and what you perceived as right. Those aren't easy waters to navigate. Bradford nodded gratefully, and I was reminded of why I had always found him the most approachable member of the Harrington extended family. An Oxford-educated architect who had married into the Harrington world, Bradford had always seemed slightly uncomfortable with the family's preoccupation with status and appearance. I've ordered for us, Victoria announced, changing the subject. The chef has prepared a special menu. James raised an eyebrow. You always did prefer controlling the details. I placed a hand on his knee beneath the table, a silent reminder that confrontation wouldn't serve our purpose tonight. Victoria's gaze flickered to the gesture, missing nothing. Some things don't change, she observed. You've always been able to communicate without words. I used to think it was an act, the perfect couple performance for family consumption. Not everything is a performance, Victoria, James replied, though his tone had softened. In our family, everything has been a performance. She took a sip of wine. That's what Father's journal revealed, isn't it? Generations of carefully constructed illusion. I glanced at her sharply. You've read it? Victoria's lips curved in a bitter smile. Not all of it. He shared selected passages with me yesterday. The ones he thought I needed to see. About Mother. About the arranged nature of their marriage. About our financial reality before your investment. The first course arrived, an artfully plated seafood creation that momentarily paused our conversation. When the server departed, Victoria continued as if there had been no interruption. I've spent my entire life upholding values that apparently were nothing more than a facade, she said, her voice controlled but with an undercurrent of genuine pain. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To discover that the principles you've structured your life around were based on fiction? It wasn't a rhetorical question. She was looking directly at me, seeking a response. It must be disorienting, I acknowledged. Having your fundamental understanding of your family challenged so completely. Victoria studied me. You're being kind. Most people would be gloating right now. Gloating wouldn't serve any purpose, I replied simply. Purpose, she repeated, sampling her food thoughtfully. You've always been very purposeful, haven't you? Even your silence about the investment had a clear purpose. I nodded, recognizing that Victoria was processing, working through her thoughts, aloud rather than making accusations. I spent 15 years believing you married James for the Harrington money and position, she continued. I treated you accordingly. I was protecting our family legacy from what I perceived as opportunism. She set down her fork. I was wrong. Completely, fundamentally wrong. The admission hung in the air between us. For Victoria Harrington to acknowledge error was unprecedented. James cleared his throat. Victoria. Let me finish, James, she interrupted, her gaze still fixed on me. I need to understand something. You had the power to shut down my behavior at any point. One word about your financial contribution would have silenced me completely. Why didn't you use it? It was the same question she had asked at the bistro, but her tone now suggested genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Power dynamics weren't. What interested me, I explained. I didn't marry James to gain power over his family. I didn't invest to gain leverage. Using the financial truth as a weapon would have undermined my entire purpose. Which was, Victoria pressed, to give James the freedom to maintain his relationship with his family without financial crisis, forcing artificial choices. To preserve, not to control. Victoria absorbed this, taking another sip of wine. That's what Father said you told him 15 years ago. I didn't believe it then. It seemed too selfless. Bradford leaned forward slightly. Not everyone approaches relationships as transactions, Victoria. She shot him a look that suggested this was a continuation of previous private discussions. As the second course arrived, a delicate mushroom risotto, Victoria shifted the conversation. Father has made you co-trustee. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes, though I didn't ask for the position. I know, she acknowledged. He told me it was his decision entirely. She hesitated. It's an appropriate recognition of your contribution. I won't contest it. Coming from Victoria, this was equivalent to enthusiastic endorsement. I nodded my thanks, recognizing the significance of her acceptance. Have you given any thought to what you'll do with the position? She asked. Maintain what works, improve what doesn't, I replied. I've always believed in substance over appearance, building actual value rather than the impression of it. Revolutionary thinking for the Harrington family, Bradford commented, with a small smile. Victoria shot her husband another look, but there was less heat in it this time. Bradford has been saying something similar for years. I never listened. Perhaps now is a good time to start, James suggested gently. An unexpected vulnerability flickered across Victoria's face. I don't know who I am, if not the guardian of the Harrington legacy as I've understood it. I've structured my entire identity around preserving something that turns out to have been largely illusory. This admission, raw and honest, revealed the true cost of Richard's revelation for Victoria. While I had been validated, she had been fundamentally destabilized. Her core identity called into question. The Harrington legacy isn't erased, I offered. It's just recontextualized. The parts worth preserving, the family connections, the community standing, the capacity to create positive impact, those remain intact. Victoria considered this. You've been thinking about this for 15 years, haven't you? About what the Harrington name could mean beyond mere appearance. I've had some time to consider it, I acknowledged with a small smile. I'd be interested in hearing those thoughts, she said, surprising me with what appeared to be genuine interest. Not tonight, but perhaps soon. It was a small opening, but a significant one. For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria was expressing interest in my perspective without ulterior motive. As the main course arrived, perfectly prepared filet mignon, the conversation shifted to safer territory. Bradford discussed his newest architectural project, a sustainable community center in Westbrook's underserved East Side. James shared updates on his investment consulting work. Even Victoria contributed with observations about community initiatives she was involved with through the Harrington Foundation. By the time dessert was served, a delicate panna cotta with fresh berries, the atmosphere had transformed from the tense beginning to something approaching comfortable, not quite warm, but no longer frigid. "Father wants to hold a family meeting next week," Victoria announced as we finished our dessert. "To formally introduce you as co-trustee and to clarify certain aspects of family history." The careful phrasing suggested Richard was planning a more complete disclosure of the Harrington financial reality to the extended family. "How do you feel about that?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Victoria considered the question, taking her time before answering. "A week ago, I would have been vehemently opposed. The Harrington image has been my life's work." She set down her dessert spoon. "But now I find myself wondering if transparency might be liberating." "It can be," James affirmed. "Living authentically always is." Victoria studied her brother with newfound curiosity. "You've known the truth all along, yet you never used it against me, even when I was at my most difficult with Olivia." "That would have hurt you without helping the situation," James replied simply. "Another example of the Mitchell-Harrington approach to family dynamics," Bradford observed. "Principles over power plays." As the evening drew to a close, Victoria surprised me again by suggesting we meet for lunch the following week, just the two of us. "There are aspects of the Harrington Foundation that could benefit from your financial acumen," she explained, careful to frame the invitation in practical terms rather than personal ones. "If you're willing." "I'd be happy to help," I agreed, recognizing the invitation for what it was, a tentative step toward a new kind of relationship. Outside the restaurant, as we waited for our cars in the cool evening air, Victoria turned to me with an expression I had never seen before, uncertainty mixed with genuine respect. 15 years, she said quietly. 15 years of unwarranted hostility from me, and you never once retaliated, never used your financial position against me, never even told the truth to defend yourself." "The truth often emerges in its own time," I replied, "as it did at your father's birthday." "That wasn't chance," Victoria observed shrewdly. "Father knew what I was planning. He deliberately arranged for Martin to be present. He chose truth over appearance," I acknowledged. "A significant evolution for a Harrington." A ghost of a smile touched Victoria's lips. "Perhaps we're all capable of evolution." She extended her hand formally. "Thank you for coming tonight, and for your patience over the years." I accepted her hand, recognizing this gesture for the milestone it represented. "Thank you for the invitation. It was a lovely evening." As James and I drove home through the quiet streets of Westbrook, he reached over to take my hand. That went better than I expected. "Victoria is nothing, if not adaptable," I observed. "She's recalibrating based on new information." "You're being generous again," James noted. "She treated you terribly for 15 years based on false assumptions she never bothered to question." "People operate from their understanding of reality," I replied. "Victoria believed she was protecting the family legacy from an outsider. That belief was wrong, but her motivation wasn't entirely without merit." James shook his head in wonder. "How do you maintain this perspective? This capacity for understanding rather than resentment?" I thought about it carefully. Resentment requires energy. energy better directed elsewhere. Understanding doesn't mean excusing behavior. It means recognizing its context. Victoria was operating from the values she was raised with, values your father himself now questions. Values you've helped transform, James pointed out. The Harrington obsession with appearance over substance is gradually giving way to something more authentic, largely because of your quiet influence. I smiled at the thought. Change happens in its own time. You can't force transformation. You can only create conditions where it becomes possible. We drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes before James spoke again. You know what I realized tonight? Victoria's never asked for your perspective before. Not once in 15 years. Tonight, she did. About the Harrington legacy. About the foundation. That's significant. It is, I agreed. Curiosity often signals the beginning of change. As we turned into our driveway, I reflected on the evening's subtle but meaningful shifts. Victoria would never be effusively warm. It wasn't in her nature. But the hostility that had characterized our relationship for 15 years had been replaced by something new. A cautious respect, perhaps even the seedling of trust. More importantly, Victoria herself seemed to be reconsidering her values, questioning the appearance-focused philosophy that had guided her life. That kind of fundamental re-examination was rare, especially for someone as certain of her worldview as Victoria had always been. Inside our home, as we prepared for bed, James brought up the impending family meeting Richard had scheduled. Are you ready for that level of public acknowledgement? He asked. It's going to change how the entire extended family relates to you. I considered the question thoughtfully. 15 years ago, I preferred anonymity because it allowed me to support your family without changing the dynamics. But perhaps those dynamics needed to change. I smiled slightly. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is allow people to see you clearly, even when that visibility challenges their comfortable narratives. That's what you've given Victoria, James observed. The uncomfortable gift of truth. Truth is rarely comfortable, I acknowledged, but it's always necessary for authentic growth. As I drifted toward sleep that night, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. 15 years ago, I had made a financial investment to preserve James's freedom to maintain his family relationships. What I hadn't anticipated was how that investment would eventually transform those relationships at their foundation. The accusation Victoria had hurled at Richard's birthday celebration, that I had been living off the Harrington family money, had, indeed, been ironic. But perhaps it had been necessary to trigger the cascade of truth that was now reshaping the family I had married into. Sometimes transformation begins with confrontation, with the collision of fiction and reality that forces new perspectives to emerge. The dinner with Victoria represented not an ending, but a beginning. The first tentative steps toward an authentic relationship based on truth rather than appearances. The path ahead wouldn't be straightforward. Decades of entrenched patterns don't dissolve overnight. But a door had opened that had previously been sealed shut, and that alone represented a victory worth celebrating. In the quiet darkness of our bedroom, with James's steady breathing beside me, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The financial investment I had made 15 years ago was finally yielding its most valuable returns, not in dollars, but in truth, in authentic connection, in the possibility of genuine family bonds unencumbered by false narratives and unspoken resentments. Some investments take time to mature. Some truths take years to emerge. But patience, coupled with unwavering principle, creates the space where transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The Harrington family was changing, evolving, beyond generations of valuing appearance over substance. And in that evolution lay the true legacy worth preserving. The week following our dinner with Victoria and Bradford brought unexpected developments. First came an email from Martin Caldwell, requesting a meeting to discuss my new role as co-trustee. Then, a handwritten note from Richard inviting James and me to lunch at his club, a venue typically reserved for his business associates rather than family gatherings. Most surprising was a message from Victoria asking if I could meet her at the Harrington Foundation offices to review their investment portfolio prior to our scheduled lunch. She's not wasting any time, James observed as I showed him Victoria's message over breakfast. Once Victoria decides on a course of action, she moves quickly. It's actually one of her better qualities, I acknowledged, when properly directed. The Harrington Foundation occupied the top floor of a historic building in downtown Westbrook. Founded by Richard's grandfather during the family's financial heyday, it had once been a significant philanthropic force in the region. In recent decades, however, it had become more symbol than substance, maintaining just enough charitable activity to preserve the Harrington name in local society pages. Victoria's assistant, a poised young woman named Elise, greeted me with unexpected warmth when I arrived. "Mrs. Harrington is waiting for you in the conference room," she said, leading me through the elegantly appointed offices. "She's been here since 7 preparing for your meeting." This detail surprised me. Victoria was famously efficient but typically delegated preparation work to her staff. That she had personally prepared suggested she was taking this interaction seriously. The conference room offered a panoramic view of Westbrook's historic district. Victoria stood at the window, her back to the door, seemingly lost in thought. She turned at our entrance, her expression composed but without the usual cool distance that typically characterized our interactions. "Olivia, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing toward the conference table where folders were neatly arranged. "I've prepared an overview of the Foundation's current portfolio and grant activities." After Elise departed, closing the door behind her, Victoria's formal demeanor shifted slightly. "I should warn you," she said, "what you're about to see isn't impressive." The candid admission took me by surprise. Victoria had always presented Harrington endeavors as unquestionably excellent, regardless of reality. "The Foundation has been operating on minimal resources for years," she continued, opening the first folder. "We've maintained the appearance of impact while actually accomplishing very little of substance. Another Harrington family specialty, it seems." The self-deprecating comment was so uncharacteristic that I found myself momentarily at a loss for words. "I'm not looking for pity," Victoria clarified, misinterpreting my silence. "Just being honest about our starting point." "Honesty is always a good place to begin," I offered, taking a seat and reaching for the financial statements she had prepared. What followed was the most productive conversation Victoria and I had ever shared. Free from pretense, we reviewed the Foundation's portfolio, a conservative mix of low-yield investments that had maintained capital but generated minimal income for actual charitable work. Victoria listened attentively as I suggested restructuring options that could significantly increase their impact without compromising stability. "Why haven't you raised these ideas before?" she asked during a brief coffee break, genuine curiosity in her tone. "You never asked," I replied simply. "And unsolicited financial advice is rarely welcomed, especially from someone you viewed with suspicion." Victoria winced slightly. Fair point. She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "I've been thinking about our conversation at dinner about substance over appearance. The Foundation embodies exactly what's been wrong with the Harrington approach. We've focused entirely on maintaining the appearance of philanthropy while accomplishing very little of actual value." It was a remarkable self-assessment coming from Victoria, an acknowledgement of flawed priorities that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. "The Foundation has potential," I offered. "With proper funding and direction, it could create meaningful impact in the community." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss," Victoria said, returning to the conference table. She extracted a document from a folder I hadn't yet seen. "This is a proposal I've been developing since our dinner. I'd like your honest assessment." The document outlined a complete restructuring of the Harrington Foundation, transforming it from a traditional family foundation into a community foundation with broader governance and more transparent operations. Victoria proposed dedicating a significant portion of her personal trust to provide proper capitalization and establishing partnerships with local community organizations to identify genuine needs rather than prestige projects. "This is substantial," I said after reviewing the proposal. "A complete reimagining of the foundation's purpose and structure." "Is it viable?" Victoria asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice that I had never heard before. "Financially and organizationally?" "With proper implementation, absolutely," I confirmed. "But it's a dramatic departure from how the foundation has operated under Harrington control. Are you prepared for that level of change?" Victoria nodded, her expression resolute. "Father's revelations forced me to reconsider everything I've prioritized. If the Harrington legacy of appearance over substance led to financial collapse 15 years ago, perhaps it's time for a different approach, one built on actual value rather than perception." The evolution in Victoria's thinking was remarkable. In just weeks, she had moved from defending the traditional Harrington approach to questioning its fundamental validity. "May I ask what prompted this specific direction?" I inquired, genuinely curious about her thought process. Victoria hesitated, then seemed to make a decision to be candid. "After our dinner, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what you said about substance over appearance. The next morning, I went through the Foundation's grant records for the past decade, evaluating actual impact rather than publicity generated." She shook her head ruefully. "The results were embarrassing. We've accomplished very little beyond maintaining the Harrington name on donor lists." She stood and walked to the window again, gazing out at the town her family had influenced for generations. "Then I thought about you, investing millions to save our family's finances while asking for no recognition. It made me question what legacy actually means. Is it a name on buildings, or is it tangible positive impact?" The vulnerability in her reflection was unprecedented. Victoria had always projected unwavering certainty about the Harrington way of doing things. This questioning represented genuine growth. "Legacy isn't static," I offered. "Each generation redefines it through their choices and priorities." Victoria turned back to face me. "I'd like the Harrington legacy to mean something more than appearances, at least in my lifetime. This proposal is my first step toward that goal." She paused, then added with uncharacteristic hesitation, "I'd value your partnership in making it succeed, both financially and structurally." It was the closest thing to an olive branch Victoria had ever extended. Not just a request for expertise, but an invitation to collaboration. "I'd be honored to help," I told her sincerely. The skeptic in me wondered if Victoria's transformation was temporary, a reaction to the shock of Richard's revelations that would fade as the initial impact diminished. But as we spent the next 2 hours refining her proposal, incorporating financial projections and governance recommendations, I saw evidence of genuine commitment to this new direction. "Bradford thinks I've had some kind of breakdown," Victoria commented as we concluded our meeting. "He's not entirely wrong. Finding out the principles you've structured your life around were largely fictional does feel like a kind of breakdown. Or a breakthrough," I suggested. "Sometimes old structures need to collapse before new ones can emerge." Victoria considered this perspective. "You've always had this balance I couldn't achieve, practical without being cynical, principled without being rigid. I used to find it suspicious. Now I find myself wanting to understand how you developed it. Perhaps that's a conversation for our lunch next week," I proposed. Victoria nodded, gathering the refined proposal. "I'll incorporate these changes." and send you the updated version before the family meeting." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Olivia. Not just for today, but for your patience over the years." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Victoria Harrington, it represented significant emotional progress. That afternoon, I met with Martin Caldwell in his office, a wood-paneled sanctuary in one of Westbrook's oldest buildings, where generations of local wealth had been managed with discreet efficiency. Martin had served as the Harrington Trust manager for over 30 years, maintaining confidentiality through financial crises and family dramas with unwavering professionalism. "Olivia," he greeted me, rising from behind his desk. "I'm pleased. You could come on such short notice." "Of course," I replied, taking the offered seat. "I assume this is about the co-trustee position?" Martin nodded, retrieving a folder from his desk drawer. "Richard has been quite insistent about formalizing your role immediately before the family meeting next week." He slid several documents across the desk. "These establish you as co-trustee with equal authority to Richard in all trust matters. I've highlighted the sections requiring your signature." As I reviewed the paperwork, Martin continued, "I must say, this is unprecedented in my experience with the Harrington family. Richard has always maintained absolute control over the trust, even during the financial difficulties 15 years ago." "People can surprise us," I commented, signing where indicated, "even after decades of established patterns." Martin's expression softened slightly. "Indeed. I've observed the Harrington family for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like the transformation currently underway." He accepted the signed documents, adding, "Your influence has been remarkable, Olivia. Not just financially, but culturally." "I didn't set out to change the family culture," I clarified. "I simply lived according to my own values while respecting theirs. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from direct challenge but from consistent example," Martin observed, surprising me with this philosophical turn. "I've watched you navigate the Harrington family dynamics for 15 years without compromising your principles or engaging in their power struggles. That quiet integrity has had more impact than you might realize." It was a perspective I hadn't fully considered, that my approach might have influenced the family beyond the financial investment itself. "There's something else," Martin said, retrieving another folder from his drawer. "Something Richard wanted me to share with you privately, before the family meeting." He opened the folder to reveal financial projections for the Harrington Trust under various management scenarios. "The bottom line is this: even with your substantial initial investment and sound management since, the trust is not equipped to support the lifestyles many family members have grown accustomed to indefinitely." I studied the projections carefully. "The younger generation will need to establish their own financial foundations," I concluded. Martin nodded. "Precisely. The trust can provide education, startup capital for ventures, housing assistance, but not permanent subsidy of luxury lifestyles." This reality check explained part of Richard's urgency in restructuring the trust and establishing me as co-trustee. He was preparing for a significant shift in how the family operated financially, a shift that would inevitably cause friction with certain family members. "Does Victoria know about this?" I asked. "She does," Martin confirmed. "Richard shared these projections with her 3 days ago. Her response was quite remarkable. She suggested accelerating the timeline for financial independence rather than prolonging the current approach." This aligned with the transformation I had witnessed in Victoria earlier that day, a movement away from appearance-focused thinking toward a more substantive, reality-based approach. "The family meeting next week will be challenging for some," Martin warned. "Many of the extended family still believe in the myth of inexhaustible Harrington wealth. Learning otherwise and simultaneously discovering your role in preserving what remains will be a significant adjustment." "Change rarely comes comfortably," I acknowledged. "But sometimes discomfort is necessary for growth." Martin studied me with professional assessment. You have the financial acumen to manage this transition effectively. Do you have the emotional fortitude to weather the reactions that will come? It was a fair question. While the core family, Richard, Victoria, and James, had begun adjusting to the new reality, the extended Harrington clan included cousins, nieces, and nephews who had built their identities and lifestyles around perceived family wealth. I didn't invest 15 years ago for recognition or control, I reminded him. But I won't shy away from the responsibility that comes with truth, however uncomfortable. Martin nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. Richard was right about you from the beginning, though he took too long to acknowledge it. You have exactly what the Harrington family needs at this juncture, principle tempered with pragmatism, strength without power-seeking. As our meeting concluded, Martin shared one final observation. In my 30 years managing family wealth, I've observed that financial capital eventually diminishes unless replenished. But moral capital, the kind you've demonstrated through your handling of the Harrington situation, compounds over time, creating returns that transcend balance sheets. That evening, James and I had dinner with Richard at his club, a wood-paneled sanctuary where Westbrook's established families had gathered for generations. It was Richard's first time hosting us there, a symbolic gesture indicating a shift in how he positioned me within the family structure. Throughout the meal, I noticed subtle changes in Richard's demeanor. The patriarchal authority that had defined his interactions remained, but it was tempered by something new, a reflective quality, a willingness to consider perspectives beyond his own. Victoria tells me you've been working on the foundation restructuring, he mentioned as dessert was served. She shared her proposal with me, I confirmed. It's thoughtfully developed and potentially transformative. Richard nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. She surprised me with her response to recent revelations. I expected resistance, perhaps even hostility. Instead, she's channeling her energy into reimagining what the Harrington name could represent. Victoria has always been adaptable, James observed. Once she accepts new information, she integrates it efficiently. A quality that serves her well in these circumstances, Richard acknowledged. He turned his attention to me. Martin tells me you've signed the trustee documents. Yes, I confirmed. Though I want to be clear about my intentions. I see the role as stewardship rather than control, preserving family resources while encouraging self-sufficiency. Richard's expression softened slightly. Exactly the approach needed. The trust was never meant to subsidize endless luxury, but to provide foundation and opportunity. He paused, then added with unexpected candor. I failed to maintain that distinction. The appearance of boundless wealth became more important than the reality of sustainable resources. Patterns can change, I reminded him gently. Even after decades. Richard studied me with newfound respect. You've known this all along, haven't you? That true wealth isn't about maintaining appearances, but about creating actual value, actual impact. My parents taught me that, I acknowledged. They built their business on that principle: substance over showmanship, integrity over impression. Principles that saved the Harrington family, Richard observed, though we took far too long to recognize their value. As we finished our meal, Richard addressed the upcoming family meeting. It won't be easy, he warned. Some family members have built their entire identities around the Harrington myth. Learning that the wealth they've taken for granted was nearly lost, and was preserved by someone they've largely ignored, will be difficult to process. Truth often is, James noted, but continuing the illusion would only postpone the inevitable while making the eventual reckoning more painful. Richard nodded agreement. Victoria and I will present a united front regarding the trust restructuring and your position as co-trustee. Having her support will make a significant difference in how the family receives these changes. As we prepared to leave, Richard surprised me by taking my hand in both of his, a gesture of personal connection he had never offered before. 15 years ago, you saved our family finances through your investment, he said, his voice uncharacteristically emotional. But your greatest contribution has been modeling a different way of being, valuing substance over appearance, integrity over impression. That example may ultimately be what truly saves the Harrington legacy. Driving home that night, James and I reflected on the remarkable transformations unfolding within his family. I never imagined Victoria would so completely reevaluate her priorities, James admitted, or that my father would acknowledge his mistaken approach so candidly. Crisis often catalyzes growth, I observed. Finding out the family narrative was largely fictional created space for new perspectives to emerge. Your perspective, James emphasized. The values you've quietly demonstrated for 15 years are suddenly being recognized as the path forward. He glanced at me with admiration. You played the long game brilliantly, Olivia. It wasn't a game, I corrected gently. It was simply living according to my principles while respecting the family's established patterns. The revelation at your father's birthday accelerated a process that might have taken another decade otherwise. But the seed was always there. The recognition. That appearance without substance is ultimately unsustainable. As we arrived home, I found myself reflecting on the convergence of events that had led to this moment of transformation within the Harrington family. Victoria's public accusation, intended to expose me as an opportunist, had instead initiated a cascade of truth that was reshaping the family's fundamental approach to legacy, wealth, and authenticity. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 15 years, I had been cast as the outsider, the gold digger who had married into the prestigious Harrington family for financial gain. The revelation that I had actually saved the family fortune had completely inverted that narrative, creating space for genuine connection where there had been only suspicion and distance. More importantly, the revelation had triggered something unexpected, not just acknowledgement of my financial contribution, but recognition of the values that had guided my approach to the complex Harrington dynamics. Substance over appearance, authenticity over illusion, principles over power plays. These values were now being embraced by the very family members who had once viewed them with skepticism or disdain. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the family meeting approaching next week. It would indeed be challenging, as both Richard and Martin had warned. But within that challenge lay opportunity, the opportunity to establish a new foundation for the Harrington legacy, one built on authenticity rather than illusion, on actual value rather than mere appearance. The transformation unfolding within the Harrington family reminded me of something my grandmother had often said. Truth has its own timeline. You can delay it, disguise it, or deny it, but eventually it emerges, and when it does, it changes everything. 15 years after my investment had saved the family finances, the truth had finally emerged in its fullness, catalyzing changes I could never have engineered directly. Sometimes the most profound influence comes not from forcing change, but from consistently embodying alternative possibilities, showing through quiet example that another way is possible. The financial investment I had made 15 years ago had preserved the Harrington family's material assets. But perhaps the more significant investment had been in demonstrating, day after day, year after year, the power of substance over appearance, of authenticity over illusion. As James and I drifted toward sleep, I felt a sense of peaceful anticipation about the path ahead. The transformation of the Harrington family was just beginning, with inevitable challenges and adjustments to come. But the foundation had shifted, from appearance to substance, from illusion to truth. And that shift would make all the difference in what the Harrington legacy ultimately became. The day of the family meeting arrived with a sense of historical significance. The Harrington clan gathered in the estate's grand salon, a room typically reserved for holiday celebrations and major announcements. Cousins, nieces, nephews, and, In-laws filled the space, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. The unexpected summons from Richard, with its formal tone and request for all adult family members to attend, had sparked speculation throughout the extended family. I stood near the window, observing the dynamics as family members greeted each other. For 15 years, I had occupied an ambiguous position within these gatherings, acknowledged as James's wife, but often subtly excluded from inner-circle conversations. Today felt different. Several family members who had previously been politely distant approached me with newfound warmth, clearly having heard rumors about the revelations at Richard's birthday celebration. Victoria arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed as always, but with a different energy about her. Instead of her usual careful survey of the room to assess social positioning, she moved directly to where I stood. "Ready?" she asked quietly. "As ready as one can be for a paradigm shift," I replied with a small smile. To my surprise, Victoria returned the smile, not her usual practiced social expression, but something more genuine. "I spoke with Cousin Edward and Aunt Margaret this morning. They're likely to be the most resistant to the financial restructuring. I thought it might help to prepare them slightly." This consideration, anticipating family reactions and working to smooth the path, represented a new kind of collaboration between us. Victoria was applying her understanding of family dynamics not to maintain appearances, but to facilitate necessary change. Richard entered last, commanding the room's attention without effort. At 75, he still carried himself with the authority that had defined him throughout his life. But there was a new quality to his presence, an authenticity that replaced the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for decades. "Thank you all for coming," he began once everyone was seated. "Today marks an important transition in the Harrington family history, one that requires complete transparency about our past, our present, and our future." He paused, surveying the room with deliberate care. For generations, the Harrington family has operated under certain assumptions about our financial standing. These assumptions have shaped how we position ourselves in society, how we approach education and careers, how we plan for the future. Today, I need to clarify some of those assumptions. A murmur rippled through the gathered family members. This directness about financial matters was unprecedented from Richard, who had always maintained that discussions of money were beneath the Harrington dignity. 15 years ago, Richard continued, the Harrington family trust faced imminent collapse. Decades of maintaining appearances while gradually diminishing actual assets, followed by several disastrous investments during the financial crisis, had left us on the verge of losing everything: the estate, our positions in the community, the legacy built over generations. The shock in the room was palpable. Cousin Edward, a florid-faced man in his 60s who had never worked a day in his life, leaned forward with an expression of disbelief. Aunt Margaret, Richard's sister-in-law and a formidable family matriarch in her own right, gripped the armrests of her chair. At that critical moment, Richard continued, salvation came from an unexpected source. He turned toward me, extending his hand in invitation. Olivia. The gesture was unmistakable, a public acknowledgement of my role and a request to join him at the center of the family gathering. I crossed the room to stand beside him, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. Many of you have speculated about Olivia's place in our family over the years, Richard said, his voice steady. Some have questioned her motives in marrying James. Some have treated her as an outsider despite 15 years of marriage. His gaze briefly found Victoria's, who had the grace to look slightly abashed. Today, I want to clarify exactly who Olivia is to the Harrington family. Richard then revealed the truth. The substantial investment I had made from my family's business proceeds, the careful restructuring of the trust under Martin Caldwell's guidance, and most significantly, the fact that the Harrington lifestyle and legacy had continued for 15 years, largely due to my financial contribution and investment guidance. The reactions around the room ranged from shock to embarrassment to calculation. Edward's face had turned from florid to ashen. Aunt Margaret studied me with newly assessing eyes. Several of the younger family members looked confused, having never questioned the narrative of boundless Harrington wealth. "I have appointed Olivia as co-trustee," Richard announced, driving home the significance of the revelation. "This position formally acknowledges her role in preserving our family's financial foundation and gives her equal authority in trust decisions moving forward." Victoria stepped forward then, taking her place on Richard's other side, a tableau that would have been unimaginable just weeks ago. "I've worked closely with Olivia this past week on restructuring the Harrington Foundation," she added, her voice carrying the authority that had always commanded family respect. "Her expertise and perspective have been invaluable. I fully support her appointment as co-trustee." This public endorsement from Victoria, who had been my most persistent critic for 15 years, shifted the energy in the room dramatically. If Victoria supported this new arrangement, the rest of the family would eventually fall in line, regardless of initial reactions. Richard continued with the more challenging portion of the meeting, explaining the trust's actual financial position and the necessary changes to family support moving forward. The days of unlimited drawing rights for extended family members were ending. The trust would continue to provide educational support and startup capital for business ventures, but no longer sustain luxury lifestyles without contribution. "This isn't punishment," Richard clarified as concerned murmurs spread through the room. "It's sustainability. The trust was never intended to support multiple generations indefinitely without their productive participation." As expected, Edward was the first to object openly. "This is outrageous," he blustered. "Harringtons have never been expected to work for a living. It's beneath our position." "Our position is precisely what's at stake, Edward," Richard replied evenly. "The choice before us is adaptation or eventual collapse. Olivia's investment gave us 15 years to adjust gradually, rather than facing immediate crisis. That time is a gift we should use wisely." Victoria stepped forward, addressing the family with the directness that had always characterized her approach. "The Harrington legacy isn't about living off inherited wealth," she stated firmly. "It's about impact, influence, and contribution. For too long, we've focused on maintaining appearances while our actual significance diminished. That changes today." She outlined her vision for the restructured Harrington Foundation, transforming it from a token philanthropic effort into a genuine force for community development. Several of the younger family members straightened in their seats, visibly engaged by this new direction. As the meeting progressed, I observed a fascinating split emerging within the family. The older generation, those who had built their identities around the traditional Harrington approach, appeared disoriented and resistant. The younger members, however, showed increasing enthusiasm for Victoria's vision of impact over appearance, substance over show. Amelia Harrington, Victoria's 28-year-old niece who had recently completed a master's degree in social entrepreneurship, spoke up with particular passion. "This is exactly what our family needs," she declared. "We've been stuck in outdated patterns that don't align with modern values. I want to be part of a Harrington legacy that creates actual value, not just maintains the illusion of it." Her endorsement sparked similar expressions from other younger family members, creating momentum that even Edward and his contemporaries couldn't entirely resist. The tide was turning before our eyes, not through force but through the magnetic pull of authentic purpose. When the formal portion of the meeting concluded, family members broke into smaller conversation groups, processing the revelations and implications. I found myself approached by relatives who had barely acknowledged me at previous gatherings, now eager to express appreciation or simply connect. Amelia sought me out specifically, her expression earnest. I've always admired how you carried yourself, she told me. You never seemed caught up in the family competition for status or recognition. Now I understand why. You were operating from a completely different value system. Not entirely different, I clarified. Just focused on substance rather than appearance, on building rather than displaying. I want to learn from that approach, she said decisively. Aunt Victoria mentioned you'll be taking an active role in the foundation restructuring. I'd love to be involved, to contribute my education and perspective. This conversation repeated itself with variations as other younger family members approached, each expressing interest in authentic contribution rather than passive inheritance. By the end of the gathering, an informal committee had formed to support the foundation's transformation, comprised primarily of the next generation of Harringtons eager to redefine what their family name represented. Victoria observed this spontaneous organization with satisfaction. You've sparked something, she noted, joining me as the gathering began to disperse. They see a different possibility for what being a Harrington could mean. The spark was always there, I replied. They just needed permission to prioritize substance over appearance, contribution over consumption. Permission that came through your example, Victoria acknowledged. 15 years of quiet demonstration that another approach was possible. She hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about what you said about legacy, that it isn't static but redefined by each generation through their choices. Perhaps that's what's happening here. The Harrington legacy isn't erased, but transformed. As the last family members departed, Richard, James, Victoria, Bradford, and I gathered in Richard's study, a wood-paneled sanctuary where generations of Harrington patriarchs had made decisions that shaped the family's course. This time, however, the energy was different. Instead of decisions flowing from a single authoritative source, there was a sense of collaborative purpose. That went better than expected, Richard observed, pouring small glasses of his prized scotch for each of us. The generational divide was evident, but not insurmountable. The younger members are ready for change, Victoria noted. They've witnessed the limitations of our traditional approach and see the value in something more authentic. They also responded to your leadership, I told her. Your endorsement of the new direction gave them permission to embrace it openly. Victoria accepted this observation with a thoughtful nod. Perhaps leadership itself is being redefined, from imposing direction to facilitating purpose. We raised our glasses in a quiet toast, not to the Harrington name as had been traditional, but to transformation, to authenticity, to the emerging possibilities represented by the day's events. Later that evening, as James and I walked along the path that circled the Harrington estate, a property that had nearly been lost 15 years ago, we reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought us to this point. When you made that investment to save the family finances, James said, did you ever imagine it would lead to this kind of fundamental transformation? I considered the question thoughtfully. The financial impact was predictable. Capital properly invested yields, returns. But the cultural impact? The shift in values and priorities? Those weren't my objective. They emerged organically through lived example. Your patience has been extraordinary, James observed. 15 years of allowing the truth to emerge in its own time, of demonstrating an alternative approach without forcing recognition. Patience isn't passive, I pointed out as we paused to watch the sunset painting the estate in golden light. It's strategic. Some transformations can't be rushed or engineered. They need to unfold naturally to be chosen, rather than imposed. The Harrington family was choosing a new direction, not because it had been demanded, but because its value had become self-evident. The financial revelation at Richard's birthday had cracked open the carefully maintained facade, creating space for authentic reassessment of priorities and possibilities. Victoria's accusation that night, "You've been living off our family's money for 15 years," had indeed been ironically backward. But perhaps it had been necessary to trigger the cascade of truth that was now reshaping the family's approach to legacy, wealth, and purpose. As darkness settled over the estate, I thought about the journey ahead. The transformation beginning within the Harrington family wasn't complete. Shifts in entrenched patterns never happen overnight. There would be resistance and regression, progress and setbacks. But the foundation had irrevocably changed from illusion to authenticity, from appearance to substance. In that shift lay the seeds of a legacy truly worth preserving, not based on names on buildings or positions in society, but on genuine impact, authentic relationships, and purposeful contribution. My investment 15 years ago had preserved the Harrington financial foundation. But perhaps the more significant investment had been in demonstrating, day after day, that another approach was possible. One built on substance rather than show, creation rather than consumption, genuine value rather than its mere appearance. Some legacies are measured in dollars, others in lives touched and values demonstrated. As James and I turned toward home in the gathering twilight, I felt profound gratitude for the opportunity to help shape both. The Harrington story was far from over, but its next chapters would be written from a place of authenticity rather than illusion. And in that authenticity lay the potential for a legacy of genuine significance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.